Bones snapped with a sickening crack, echoing through the desolate expanse of the Bitterroot Mountains. Giselle lay paralyzed beneath the shattered remains of her wagon, the freezing Montana winds stealing her breath. Night was falling. The wolves were waking, and her only prayer was for a swift, merciful end. The year was 1881, and the western frontier was an unforgiving beast that swallowed the weak without a second thought. Giselle Prescott, a 24-year-old botanical illustrator from Philadelphia, had believed herself prepared. Commissioned by the prestigious Peabody Academy to document the rare flora of the Pacific Northwest, she had funded the expedition with her late father's inheritance. In the bustling frontier town of Missoula, she had hired Hiram Croft, a seasoned guide with a leathered face and a supposedly sterling reputation. It was a fatal misjudgment. The betrayal had not been born of sudden panic, but of cold, calculated greed. They were 3 days deep into the jagged, treacherous terrain of the Lolo Pass when the descent grew dangerously steep. Giselle had been riding in the back of the reinforced supply wagon, carefully packing away her glass plate negatives, when she felt the wagon surge unnaturally forward. The brake line had been deliberately severed. She remembered Hiram's face devoid of panic, eyes hard and calculating as he leaped from the driver's bench onto the back of his saddle horse, cutting the hitching lines to the wagon's draft team in one swift motion. He had already secured her leather lockbox, containing every dollar she owned, to his saddle horn. Giselle had screamed his name, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the roar of the wind and the terrifying splintering of wood as the wagon careened off the narrow trail. The world had turned upside down, a chaotic blur of pine branches, jagged rocks, and blinding sky. When the wagon finally violently halted at the bottom of a steep ravine, smashing against a massive Douglas fir, Giselle was thrown into the bed of the wagon, pinned beneath a heavy oak water barrel and the collapsed canvas roof. Now, hours later, the silence of the wilderness was deafening. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by an agony so blinding it made her vision swim. Her right leg was trapped under the tremendous weight of the barrel. The tibia fractured so severely that her lower leg sat at a grotesque, unnatural angle. Every shallow breath sent shockwaves of pain radiating up her spine. The temperature was plummeting rapidly as the October sun dipped below the jagged peaks. Frost began to crystallize on the splintered wood around her. Giselle's hands, clad in torn leather gloves, were numb, her fingers slipping helplessly against the smooth, freezing wood of the barrel as she tried for the 100th time to push it off. She was going to die here. The realization settled over her not with panic, but with a heavy, suffocating sorrow. She thought of her quiet studio in Philadelphia, the smell of linseed oil and dried lavender. She thought of the sketches she would never finish. A low, mournful howl echoed through the canyon. The gray wolves of the Bitterroots were beginning their evening hunt. They would smell the overturned supplies. They would smell her. Tears froze on Giselle's pale cheeks. She closed her eyes, the darkness behind her eyelids offering a strange comfort. "Lord," she whispered, her voice a cracked, fragile thread in the massive wilderness. "I ask not for rescue, for I know I am too far gone. But I pray for a miracle. Let it be quick. Do not let me suffer the teeth of the wild. Send an angel, or send the cold, but please, let it be over." She surrendered to the encroaching blackness, letting her chin fall to her chest. Crunch. Giselle's eyes fluttered open. It was a heavy sound, deliberate, the breaking of snow crust and dry pine needles beneath immense weight. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The wolves were here. She strained to turn her head, peering through the wreckage of the wagon. A massive shadow moved through the tree line. It was too tall to be a wolf, too broad to be a cougar. As it stepped into the pale moonlight filtering through the canopy, Giselle's breath caught in her throat. It was a man, though he looked more like a force of nature. He was towering, easily over 6 feet tall, draped in thick layers of buckskin and a heavy grizzly bear pelt that made his shoulders look impossibly wide. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, and a wide-brimmed hat sat pulled low over his eyes. In one massive gloved hand, He held a long-barreled Winchester rifle. He approached the wreckage with silent, predatory grace, his boots making barely a whisper now. He stopped a few feet from the wagon, his steely gaze sweeping over the debris, assessing the dead draft horses, the missing lockbox, and finally, the severed brake lines. He knew instantly what had happened here. Then, his eyes, a striking, piercing blue, locked onto the gap in the canvas where Giselle lay. "Help," she tried to say, but the word was only a dry rasp. The mountain man slung his rifle over his shoulder and moved with startling speed. He didn't speak. He crouched beside the wreckage, gripping the edge of the heavy oak barrel that had trapped her. Muscles strained visibly beneath his buckskin jacket. With a low, guttural grunt, he heaved the 300-pound barrel upward and shoved it aside as if it were made of kindling. Giselle cried out as the pressure released, a fresh wave of excruciating pain washing over her broken bones. "Easy, girl," a voice rumbled. It was deep, gravelly, and entirely unused to conversation, like boulders grinding together at the bottom of a river. "I got you." He knelt beside her, pulling off a thick leather glove to press 2 calloused fingers against the pulse point at her neck. His skin was warm, a shocking contrast to the freezing air. He carefully examined her leg, his jaw tightening. "Bones broke clean, but it ain't through the skin," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You're lucky you ain't bled out. The cold saved you." "Who?" Giselle stammered, her teeth chattering violently. "Name's Gideon. Gideon Cole," he said, swiftly shrugging off his heavy bear pelt and wrapping it tightly around her shivering frame. It smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and leather. "We ain't got time for pleasantries. Storm's coming over the ridge, and wolves are tracking the blood from your horses. This is gonna hurt." Before she could process his words, Gideon produced a thick leather strap from his belt. "Bite down on this." She barely had the leather between her teeth before Gideon gripped her ankle and her knee. With a swift, sickeningly precise motion, he pulled and twisted. Giselle's muffled scream tore through the leather strap, and a merciful, absolute darkness swallowed her whole. Warmth. It was the first sensation that breached the void. A dry, crackling warmth that radiated against her skin, chasing away the bone-deep ache of the Montana winter. Giselle slowly blinked open her eyes, her vision swimming in a hazy golden light. She was no longer in the snowy ravine. She was lying on a sturdy, hand-hewn wooden bed, enveloped in thick woolen blankets and soft rabbit furs. Above her, a ceiling of heavy pine logs was stained black with years of wood smoke. To her right, a massive stone fireplace dominated the room, a roaring fire casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. The cabin was immaculately clean but intensely rugged. Bunches of dried herbs and roots hung from the rafters, swaying slightly in the draft. A cast-iron pot simmered over the fire, filling the air with the rich, savory aroma of venison stew. Giselle shifted, and a sharp, breathtaking spike of pain shot up her right leg. She gasped, gripping the edges of the fur blankets. Looking down, she saw her leg had been expertly set and bound between 2 straight planks of cedar, wrapped tightly in clean linen bandages. "Don't move it," the deep voice startled her. From the shadowed corner of the cabin, Gideon Cole emerged. Without his heavy furs and hat, he was even more intimidating. He wore a simple, worn flannel shirt that strained across his broad chest, and his dark, wavy hair brushed the collar of his shirt. His beard was thick but trimmed, framing a strong, angular jaw and those striking, ice-blue eyes that seemed to miss absolutely nothing. He walked over to the bed, holding a tin cup steaming with a dark liquid. "Drink this. It's willow bark and yarrow. Tastes like mud, but it'll take the fire out of that leg." Giselle pushed herself up onto her elbows, wincing. Gideon's large hand came up behind her shoulders, surprisingly gentle, supporting her weight as he brought the cup to her lips. She drank. He was right. It was incredibly bitter, but the warmth of the tea spread through her chest soothingly. "How long have I been here?" she asked, her voice raspy. 2 days, Gideon replied, setting the cup down on a wooden side table. "You had a fever. Kept thrashing around, nearly unset the bone. Had to sit on you to keep you still." Giselle's cheeks flushed at the thought. You saved my life, Mr. Cole. I don't know how to repay you. Gideon pulled up a crude, three-legged stool and sat heavily, resting his forearms on his knees. He looked at her with an unreadable expression. You repay me by living. Ground's too hard to dig a grave this time of year. He leaned forward slightly. Now, I want you to tell me exactly what happened on that pass. Wagons don't just jump off Lolo Trail. Giselle took a trembling breath, the memory of the betrayal still a raw wound in her chest. Slowly, she recounted the events. She told him about her commission in Philadelphia, her journey west, and the man she had hired in Missoula. He said the trail was safe before the heavy snows, Giselle explained, her voice tightening with anger. He waited until the steepest grade. I felt the brake line snap. No, I felt it give way smoothly, like it had been cut. And then he was gone, with my lockbox. He left me to die, Mr. Cole. Gideon's jaw muscle ticked. He picked up a piece of firewood and tossed it into the hearth, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. What was his name? Hiram Croft, Giselle said. The silence that followed was heavy and immediate. The crackle of the fire seemed to fade. Gideon stopped moving completely. When he finally turned to look at her, the ice in his blue eyes had shattered, replaced by a burning, terrifying intensity. You're sure of that name? Gideon's voice dropped an octave, rumbling with a suppressed, lethal energy. Average height? Scar through his left eyebrow? Rides a piebald gelding? Giselle's eyes widened in shock. Yes, exactly. How do you know him? Gideon stood up slowly, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the bed. He walked to the window, staring out into the blinding white of the snowstorm raging outside. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling wind rattling the heavy wooden shutters. 3 years ago, Gideon began, his voice devoid of emotion, which somehow made it vastly more chilling. I had a younger brother, Caleb. We were trapping beaver up near the Canadian border. We ran into a man claiming he'd lost his party, nearly starved to death. We took him in, fed him, let him sleep by our fire. Gideon gripped the windowsill, the wood groaning under his strength. I went out at dawn to check the trap lines. When I came back, the camp was gone. Our pelts, our horses, our money. And Caleb, Gideon closed his eyes, taking a ragged breath. Caleb was lying in the snow, shot in the back for a pouch of gold dust. Giselle put a hand over her mouth, horror washing over her. Hiram Croft. I tracked him for 6 months, Gideon continued, turning back to her. Lost his trail in the spring thaws near Oregon. I built this cabin. I stayed in these mountains because I knew, sooner or later, a rat like Croft always comes back to the frontier where the law is thin. I've been waiting. The atmosphere in the cabin had irrevocably shifted. Giselle realized she wasn't just sitting with a savior. She was sitting with a hunter. He has my money, Giselle said softly, a new, steely resolve hardening in her chest. It was everything I had to build a life out here, to prove I wasn't just some fragile city girl. She looked directly into Gideon's intimidating gaze. When my leg heals, I want him found. Gideon looked at the refined, fragile-looking woman in his bed, noting the fierce, unexpected fire in her brown eyes. A slow, dark smirk ghosted across his lips. Oh, we'll find him, Miss Prescott, Gideon said softly, walking over to a wooden chest in the corner and pulling out a heavy leather gun belt, checking the cylinders of his Colt revolver. Croft thought he was leaving a loose end to freeze in the mud. Instead, he just pointed me right to him. He holstered the gun with a sharp metallic click. Rest up, because when that snow breaks, we're going hunting. The Bitterroot winter of 1881 did not merely arrive, it descended like an iron vault, sealing the cabin in a world of blinding white and howling gales. For 5 months, the frontier outside ceased to exist. Inside, the world shrank to the span of a hearth, the smell of wood smoke, and the profound, charged silence between two strangers, forced into absolute intimacy. Giselle's recovery was a brutal, agonizing crawl. The fractured tibia demanded total immobility for the first 6 weeks. For a woman fiercely independent, being bedridden was a torture that rivaled the physical pain. Yet, Gideon tended to her with a stoic, unflinching grace that continuously shattered her preconceived notions of a mountain man. He changed her dressings, brewed willow bark tea to break her recurring fevers, and fed her a rich, continuous diet of elk, bone broth, and dried berries to knit her bones back together. Through the long, dark days, they talked. Giselle spoke of the crowded, soot-stained streets of Philadelphia, the polite but stifling society that viewed her botanical ambitions as a mere feminine eccentricity. She told him of her father, a quiet professor who had taught her to see the architecture in a simple fern. In return, Gideon offered fragments of his own shadowed past. He spoke of his childhood in the Shenandoah Valley, of the war that had torn his family apart, and of Caleb, the golden-haired younger brother he had brought west, promising him a world untouched by the blood of men. "I promised my mother I'd keep him safe," Gideon murmured one evening in late January, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The golden light danced across the rugged planes of his face, softening the hardened lines around his eyes. "I failed her, and I failed him. You did not pull the trigger, Gideon," Giselle said softly from the bed. Over the weeks, the formal titles had melted away, replaced by a quiet familiarity. "Out here, failing to see the wolf in a man's eyes is the same as pulling the trigger yourself," he replied, his voice heavy with a guilt that threatened to crush him. Giselle reached over the edge of the bed. Gideon looked at her outstretched, slender hand, then slowly reached out, wrapping his massive, calloused fingers around hers. The contact sent a jolt of electricity up Giselle's arm. His thumb brushed gently over her knuckles, a startlingly tender gesture from hands built for survival and violence. In that quiet, snow-muffled cabin, the air thickened with an unspoken vow, a bond forged in shared grief and survival. By March, Giselle was finally allowed out of the bed. Gideon had carved her a sturdy crutch from a thick piece of seasoned hickory, padding the top with rabbit fur. Her first steps were agonizing, her muscles atrophied and trembling. When her leg gave out on her third step across the cabin floor, she didn't fall. Gideon was there instantly, his strong arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat as she met his piercing blue eyes. He was so close she could smell the pine resin and clean sweat on his skin. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, a silent, desperate hunger flashing across his face, before he gently helped her to the chair by the window. "You're rushing it," he said, his voice unusually thick. "I refuse to be useless," Giselle retorted, her cheeks burning from the proximity. To pass the time and regain her dexterity, Giselle had taken to sketching on rough parchment with charred pieces of wood from the fire. She drew the dried herbs, the rusted iron skillet, and, when he wasn't looking, she drew Gideon. She captured the slope of his shoulders as he chopped wood outside the window, the intense focus in his eyes as he cleaned his rifle. One afternoon, Gideon returned early from checking his traps and found a piece of parchment resting on the table. He picked it up. It was a stunningly detailed charcoal portrait of himself, looking out toward the mountains. In the drawing, the harsh, feral edges of his appearance were softened, revealing the deeply honorable, broken man she had come to know. "You make me look like a gentleman," he said quietly, looking from the paper to her. Giselle met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away. "Perhaps I just draw what is already there, beneath the bear grease and buckskin." A slow, devastating smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. He stepped toward her, the space between them evaporating. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, tilting her face upward. When his lips met hers, it was not the frantic clash of a desperate frontier, but a slow, reverent claiming. It was the taste of rain and salvation. Giselle kissed him back with a fierce, answering heat, her hands knotting in the fabric of his flannel shirt, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in a world that had tried to break her. By late April, the Bitterroots began to weep. The snowpack melted into roaring, icy rivers, and the Lolo Pass was finally clear. Giselle walked with a pronounced limp, but she no longer needed the crutch. It was time. Gideon spent 2 days oiling his weapons and packing the remaining supplies. He handed Giselle a sleek, silver-plated Colt .38 Lightning revolver. Keep it hidden in your coat pocket. Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to kill. There is no in-between out here. Giselle took the cold steel, its weight a grim reminder of their purpose. She was no longer the naive illustrator who had boarded a train in Philadelphia. The wilderness had stripped away her illusions, and Gideon Cole had taught her how to survive the reality beneath them. They saddled their horses and rode out of the canyon, leaving the sanctuary of the cabin behind. They were riding toward the Idaho Territory, toward the booming, lawless chaos of the Coeur d'Alene silver camps. They were riding for blood. The frontier town of Wallace was a festering wound in the side of a beautiful valley. Fueled by silver, the town was a chaotic labyrinth of muddy streets, canvas tents, and wooden buildings smelling of cheap whiskey and desperation. The stamping mills echoed endlessly against the canyon walls, a mechanical heartbeat of greed. Gideon and Giselle rode into town under an overcast sky. They tied their horses near the livery stable. Gideon's presence drew uneasy stares. He looked like a wild thing dragged down from the peaks, a predator walking among scavenging dogs. "I checked the assayer's office," Gideon told her, his voice low. "Croft used your lockbox funds to buy a stake in the Widow's Peak silver claim. He set himself up as a gentleman miner. Stays at the Northern Hotel. Plays faro at the Crystal Saloon." "We go to the saloon," Giselle said, touching the Colt in her pocket. "No." "I go," Gideon corrected, eyes hardening. "Croft has hired muscle. You stay." "He stole my future, Gideon. I won't cower in a barn." Gideon looked at her, seeing the unyielding iron in her posture. He sighed. "Stay by the door. If lead starts flying, drop." The Crystal Saloon was a den of gilded vice. A massive mahogany bar spanned one wall. A crystal chandelier hung above. Through the cigar smoke, they spotted him. Hiram Croft sat at a high-stakes poker table in the back. He wore a tailored suit. He looked untouched by the frontier's cruelty. Gideon moved through the room like a shadow, the drunken miners parting before his massive frame. Giselle followed, her heart hammering. Gideon stopped 10 feet from the table. Croft. The name cut through the piano music. It carried a lethal frequency that made the men nearby freeze. Hiram Croft looked up. The smug confidence drained from his face instantly, replaced by sickly terror. He recognized the giant before him, the man he had robbed in the snow 3 years ago. Then, Croft's eyes shifted to the woman standing behind Gideon. His jaw went slack. "Miss Prescott, you're dead." "The wilderness did its best," Giselle said, her voice ringing clear across the saloon. "But you underestimated it, and you underestimated me," Croft sneered. A heartwarming reunion. "You want your money, Giselle? And you, mountain man, want blood for your brother." Croft leaned back, snapping his fingers. "Too bad you're outnumbered." 4 railroad enforcers stood up, dropping hands to heavy revolvers. They formed a semicircle around Gideon. The twist was sudden. Croft had been anticipating the ghosts of his past. "Kill the mountain man," Croft ordered. "Take the girl out back." The saloon erupted into chaos. Gideon moved impossibly fast. Before the closest thug could clear leather, Gideon's fist smashed his jaw, dropping him instantly. Gideon drew his Colt, firing from the hip. The booming roar deafened the room. A second thug slammed backward into a table, a red stain blossoming on his chest. But there were too many. A third man tackled Gideon from the side, sending both crashing through a wooden banister. Gideon's gun was knocked away. The fourth man raised his rifle, aiming down at Gideon's chest as he struggled on the floor. "Gideon!" Giselle screamed. She didn't panic. The months surviving the Bitterroots took over. Giselle drew the silver-plated Colt, raised it with both hands, and pulled the trigger. The shot was true. The bullet struck the rifleman's shoulder, spinning him violently. His shot went wide into the ceiling, shattering the crystal chandelier. Glass rained down like deadly snow. Using the distraction, Gideon surged upward, grabbing his attacker by the throat and hurling him across the room. Hiram Croft, realizing his hired guns were failing, pulled a small derringer. He aimed it not at Gideon, but at Giselle, knowing the mountain man would throw himself in the path of the bullet. "Drop it, Cole!" Croft shrieked. Gideon froze, staring in horror at the barrel pointed at the woman he loved. "I said drop it!" Croft's finger tightened. Giselle didn't wait for Gideon to surrender his life for hers. She cocked her Colt a second time. Her hands were perfectly steady. She looked Hiram Croft dead in the eyes, seeing the exact same cowardly greed from the Lolo Pass. She fired. The bullet struck Croft square in the chest. He staggered backward, a look of profound shock on his face. He dropped the derringer, clutching his ruined vest, before collapsing heavily to the floor. The saloon was dead silent. Gideon stood up slowly, breathing heavily. He looked at Croft's lifeless body, then crossed the room in 3 massive strides, pulling Giselle into a fierce, crushing embrace. Giselle buried her face in his buckskin jacket, trembling as the adrenaline crashed. "You saved my life," Gideon whispered roughly. "We are even, Mr. Cole," she murmured back. An hour later, with the sheriff appeased by a generous bribe from Croft's winnings, they stood inside the assayer's office. The terrified clerk handed over a leather satchel containing the deed to the silver claim and a stack of fresh banknotes. Giselle stepped onto the boardwalk. The storm clouds had broken over Wallace, revealing a brilliant blue sky above the jagged peaks. Gideon stood beside her. "You're a wealthy woman, Giselle. You can take the next train east, back to civilization." Giselle looked at the wild, untamed mountains towering over the valley. Philadelphia felt like a lifetime ago, a different girl's life. She turned to Gideon, resting her hand against his solid chest. "I have no desire to go east, Gideon. My studio is wherever the wild things grow, and I find I have developed a deep fondness for the local wildlife." Gideon's ice-blue eyes warmed with blinding, joyful light. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against him. "The bitterroots are mighty cold in the winter," he warned, a smile playing on his lips. "Then it is a good thing I brought you," Giselle replied softly, rising onto her toes to kiss him, to keep the fire burning. Together, they turned away from the Silver City, walking back toward their horses, ready to ride into the unforgiving wilderness they had conquered, side by side. Did Giselle and Gideon's fight for survival and vengeance leave you breathless? If you love this gritty tale of Wild West romance, betrayal, and redemption, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share